Hello friends, good afternoon. Welcome to CEC EduSet lecture. Following a lecture series which is going on political thought, today we are having lecture on political thought of Hobbes. For this we have our subject expert with us, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, and he is associate professor, Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. He has been teaching since last 25 years, and he has the specialization in Indian politics and political thought. So with this brief introduction and without wasting time, I would like to welcome Dr. Jha and request him to continue with his lecture.
Thank you, Smita. And today's lecture will have on the political thought of Thomas Hobbes, the modern liberal thinker who basically belonged to 17th century, and his thought has been very influential in shaping the evolution and development of liberalism over the ages. So, Hobbes basically remains a pioneer so far as liberalism and liberal political thought is concerned. Now, while discussing Hobbes and his ideas, political ideas, it is imperative that we also take into account the context in which Hobbes was developing his thought. Now, as we have discussed it earlier also in context of other thinkers, that social, political, economic contexts are always influential in shaping and determining the broad contours of thinking of individuals who basically gradually emerge as thinker and their ideas become political thought. So, Hobbes is no exception here. Now, what was the context of his writings? That is important. Of course, there is a lot of debate in political thought also on this question of method, that whether ideas can be reduced to the social context, and therefore, the sociology of knowledge, how far it is valid so far as understanding the political thought of a particular person is concerned. Because after all, political thought becomes a subject matter of interpretation, because these peoples wrote and developed their ideas 300, 400 years ago, and for example, the Greek thinkers developed 2000 years ago. And today, when we basically engage with their thought, when we try to interpret their thought, then we have to basically devise some method, some mechanism to interpret them. So, how to do it so that a correct perspective could emerge, where we can truly understand that from what point of view and what was the purpose of their writings, what was the purpose of this entire exercise which they basically undertook then. So, therefore, this method is important thing, and the sociology of knowledge often comes handy, because after all we can contextualize and place the thought of a thinker in a social, economic and political context. So, basically keeping in mind the importance of this thing, we have to keep in we have to basically see that what were the changes which were taking place around that time, that is 17th century Europe, because Europe was undergoing major changes, transformations in all spheres of life, social, political, cultural, economic, and those changes were basically revolutionary changes, and it had far reaching consequences for human civilization, and therefore, number of people came forward who basically reflected, imagined and basically hypothesized about the future of humanity. And one such person was Thomas Hobbes, who basically was born in England, and basically his writings are mostly in context of the Civil War in England, particularly the 1649, this Puritan Revolution as it is referred. Now, the changes, when we talk of changes in Europe around that period of time, the three important changes which normally one basically encounters, one is this reformation within the Christianity, because as we are aware that the medieval period was characterized by a lot of things in which the religion was basically occupying the most important place. And after this period of the supremacy of religion, papacy, God and so on and so forth, we have had questioning, interrogation and challenges, and particularly it emerged from religion itself, and therefore within Christianity in Europe we have had this entire reformations, and this reformation, particularly the Protestantism as it is commonly understood, led to far reaching changes, and that of course most of the societies in the world have gone through this process, but European changes were significant, because whatever changes took place in Europe gradually got transported to different parts of the world through the medium of colonialism and so on and so forth. So, what happened, this reformation was one important context, the fight between on the issue of religion and the supremacy of church, pope, etc., etc. But around the same time one important development was taking place, and that was basically the fight between the monarchy and the church, because the medieval period was known for combining the two power, the material power and the spiritual power, and therefore this combination ruled the entire Europe medieval period. But modern period has started with this fight, when the first phase of this fight was between the church and the state, and therefore this fight was crucial, because what happened that with this fight the autonomy and sovereignty of state were determined, and it was basically defined and carved out. But the second fight was also equally decisive, and that was a fight between the people and the parliament, people and basically the king, the state, and that laid the foundation of what today we know as democracy, the modern liberal democracy. But what happened, the Hobbes and his writings are basically in context of the Civil War of 1649, and that was the time when basically king was locked in a fight with the parliament, that who is supreme, who is the supreme wielder of the power, the parliament or the king, the monarchy. So, therefore, this fight ultimately created a situation where there was turbulence, there was disorder, it was a chaotic situation, an anarchic situation, and therefore Hobbes basically when he is writing, particularly he wrote two important books. In fact, one is Leviathan, perhaps, which is his magnum opus so far as his political discourse is concerned, and the second book is philosophical and writings concerning government and society. Now, philosophical readings concerning government and society published in 1659. So, these writings are basically giving us some clue to understand that what he was arguing and what for he was arguing. So, basically this entire writing, Hobbes' writing, can be seen from the point of view of this disorder, social chaos, the turbulence which existed at that point of time. Hobbes, so far as Hobbes' background is concerned, he was son of a clergyman. In fact, he went even to the Oxford, one of the most important and famous place of learning, when he was just 15 years of age, and later on he also tutored one a royal personality, royalty. So, he had his association with the royal household, and therefore, what he did through his writings, that he justified and legitimized monarchy and monarchical form of government, rather in a powerful state, an absolute state, he justified and legitimized. Now, this is somewhat also paradoxical, because on the one hand he is also considered the pioneer of individualism and liberalism. On the other hand, his writings end up justifying absolutism and absolute power of the state. But one has to see the context, that why he was justifying this absolutism and basically the absolute power of the state, and that we have to see in context of the other important change which was taking place, and that was basically the changes which were happening in realm of economy, and that was the birth and rise of capitalism, the emerging bourgeois society, the markets economy, and the kind of interest the middle class, particularly the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class had at that time, particularly in order, in peace, in tranquility and stability of the society. And therefore, many people, many scholars who have argued, who have worked on Hobbes, including one of the most important and celebrated commentary on Hobbes is by C.B. Macpherson. Macpherson believes that Hobbes was basically championing their cause, the emerging bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, because capitalism at that time required a peaceful, orderly, stable market, and therefore what Hobbes argued, that the state has to take this responsibility on its shoulder to ensure that there is peace and stability in the market, otherwise capitalist development would have suffered. So therefore, Macpherson uses the term possessive individualism, the kind of human nature which Hobbes basically paints and picturizes, largely resembles with the nature of a man in a market situation or market society, and he calls it possessive individualism, appetite, appetite for position, endless appetite for position, acquisitiveness, and all these things, which of course have not been accepted by many people. Even if many thinkers have accepted it, they relate it to society. They do not say that this is the innate character or nature of human beings, which perhaps Hobbes argued, that it is the innate character of human beings that man would endlessly desire two things, power and basically wealth. So this is a psychological analysis which Hobbes offers and relates it to human nature, was largely the characterization of the situation which he was encountering at that time, that was the rise of capitalism. And the third important development which was also taking place was the scientific revolution, because modern era did not start only with this reformation, but three things came in quick succession and laid the foundation for this modernity, what is normally understood to be a situation where basically reason started dominating over faith, and man's reason and rationalism became the defining characteristics of human civilization. So scientific revolution was another important development of that period, and therefore when it comes to method which Hobbes basically made use of, I think that this scientific method had tremendous influence on Hobbes, and we will also discuss that how Hobbes was influenced by Galileo when he met Galileo, because it is also to be understood, it is also to be remembered that Hobbes basically travelled all through Europe. Because of his association with royalty, he could afford this travel, and he travelled all across Europe, and he met many people, many literary figures, many scientific figures, but most importantly he met Galileo, and Galileo had lasting influence on Hobbes, particularly his scientific method influenced him considerably, particularly his theory of motion. And therefore, at that time the two important scientists who were basically influential in that era, one was Newton, another was Galileo, and it was Galileo who influenced Hobbes rather Newton. We will basically take up that in what sense we can say and in what sense we can trace the influence of Galileo on basically Hobbes's political thought. So therefore, what happens that by using this scientific method, he simply wanted to lay the foundation for science of politics. The way there can be science of nature, Hobbes believed that there can also be science of politics. And what would be the science of politics? What would be the unit of analysis? What can be the basis on which the science of politics could be laid? And therefore, what Hobbes basically argues and what he does, that he starts with human nature, and with the human nature, description of human nature, by using this scientific method, he arrives at certain conclusions, and those conclusions basically, on basis of those conclusions, he basically argues that only with the absolute power of the state, only with the absolutism, that human society is possible, human progress is possible, and human beings can realize their freedom, their rights, and everything. So therefore, making use of this scientific method, drawing on the natural science and basically the science of nature, Hobbes basically moves in direction of creating a science of politics, and therefore it is something quite significant. Of course, this method became later quite popular, and in fact it did not stop with Hobbes, but Hobbes's contributions should be seen in terms of laying foundation for many core concepts of politics and political science or political thought. For example, the concept of sovereignty, state sovereignty, the concept of law, concept of political obligation, concept of legal theory of rights, all these things are basically foundational issues and themes in political theory and political thought, and these issues cannot be discussed without having a reference of Thomas Hobbes in terms of the powerful argument which he puts on all these issues which I have mentioned just now. So, therefore, what happens that even on concept of sovereignty, of course, before Hobbes there was a philosopher, French philosopher Baudin, who had already laid the foundation for for theoretical, who had already given the theoretical understanding of sovereignty. But his sovereignty was a limited sovereignty, and it was constrained by number of factors which we will see later. But what Hobbes did, that removed those constraints and made it absolute and therefore totally monistic. And later on, this monistic theory of sovereignty which became a powerful instrument to theorize on politics, basically can be traced back to the ideas of Thomas Hobbes. Apart from this, apart from laying the foundation for this monism, what Hobbes did, that he secularized the basis of sovereignty, because before Hobbes, what was the situation? The most commonly understood and most popular theory of the origin of a state was basically the divine origin theory of a state, and it was Robert Filmer who was basically considered the pioneer of this argument, the divine origin theory of the state, that where from the state has come, it is basically a gift of the God. God has created state for the welfare of human beings, because human beings are also the creature of God, and therefore in their welfare God has sent this instrument or this institution called state. So, basically kings were considered the representative of God, they were speaking a version of God. So, that was the commonly understood theory of the state, and this argument was totally turned down, and Hobbes came forward with something new, and that is known as social contract theory, which is to some extent considered as the basis for the subsequent development of liberalism. Now, social contract theorists, as we are aware, that of course included Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau, but Hobbes still is a pioneer, because he was the first one who argued it, and he said that a state is neither gift of God nor is the creation of any supernatural force. The state is basically the product of a contract among the people. So, basically he put man on the seat of God, that is, a man who has created this institution called a state, and why it has created, that he explains with philosophical reasoning and a lot of rigor to prove that state is one of the important requirements for society to exist. If a state doesn't exist, society will get dissolved. So, therefore, what happens, that the existence of society is contingent on a state. So, philosophically, basically it appears that the society's existence is intimately tied to the existence of state. It is only a state which brings society into existence and in order. So, this is basically this entire philosophical basis of this argument within the social contract tradition. Of course, it is also to be remembered that they were not arguing historically, but they are arguing philosophically. It was an argument, basically philosophical argument, it was basically argument to justify a particular set of things, or it was basically argument in order to legitimize this authority of the state. So, this is how basically Hobbes' writings moves, and basically create a situation where he starts with the human nature, then he moves to the state of nature, and from a state of nature he basically argues for a contract, the covenants among the people, and the contract and the covenant which ultimately result into the creation of the state, and therefore a state become an artifact, basically artificial creation, a machine, and basically it is there in the interest of the people. But at the same time, one should also remember that the other contract theorists like Locke and Rousseau basically put lot of conditionalities and made this state the product of contract, but nonetheless dependent on the will of the people. But in Hobbes, of course, is the product of the will of the people, but the state later on attains autonomy, in the sense that Hobbes does not give the people right to rebel or basically right to revolution, or because he thought that the moment state is revolted against, the moment there is a protest, there is a revolution, again this disorder and chaos and anarchy would set in. And this was the reason that initially man entered into this contract to form this state of nature. So, therefore, he is basically laying the foundation of absolutism, and therefore, at times it becomes paradoxical. On one hand, he starts with individual rights, individualism and individual attributes, reason, will, contract, but ultimately his argument ends up justifying royal absolutism or monarchy. But before we look at all these important themes which I have just now mentioned, let us first of all see his method, that what was his method. Now, what has happened that like other thinkers of his period, the scientific developments which were taking place, those developments had tremendous influence on their thought process, and accordingly what happens that during that period, one of the important development in science was the science of mechanics, and mechanics was basically one development which was meant to explain all types of motion. In fact, it was also believed that particularly Galileo argued that motion is natural in natural state of all objects, including human beings. Now, of course, as I was mentioning, that the Newton and Galileo stands on the two different sides of this spectrum, whereas Newton believed that state of motion basically is there, but Galileo's argument is quite interesting, because Galileo says that everything is in a state of rest, and Newton said that everything is in a state of motion. Now, Galileo said that the state of rest has to be moved by external force to make it move, whereas for Newton, this state of motion was only there to control it. So, therefore, what happens that this entire method of motion at that time, the debate between Newton and Galileo, became central so far as this political discourse of Hobbes is concerned. What happens that Hobbes of course drew on Galileo, not on Newton, and therefore what he believed that human beings are also like any natural object, that is basically is a matter, and therefore it is in motion. But that motion, how to be basically controlled, that is important. That this motion is not to be moved, but it has to be controlled. So, therefore, this control mechanism was central to his entire discourse. Of course, like other scientists of the period, Hobbes also argued that science's main concerns should be matter, not supernatural or religious discourses or religious issues, and therefore this matter, the material aspect, is quite important, and therefore basically he believed that a debate in science should take place in material terms. Now, along with these two developments, the development of mechanics and development of materialism basically became the basis for this entire mechanical materialism, which is normally referred to when we come to Hobbes's political thought. Now, what happened that this mechanical materialism was the basis on which Hobbes wanted to build the foundation of this new science of politics, and therefore mechanical materialism is basically the method through which Hobbes tried to analyze and interpret human nature. Apart from this, Galileo, and particularly his theory of motion, that everything is in motion, and therefore that motion has to be controlled, and that makes puts a man in a situation of incessant activity, and that activity of course he explains through his theory of state of nature, contract, and so on and so forth. We will come to this later. But apart from this mechanical materialism, there was another important influence on him was Euclid's geometrical propositions, particularly as they were formulated and propounded in elements. Now, at the age of 40 years, he basically came across this writing. Now, what happened that Hobbes's purpose was to demonstrate with certainty through geometrical reasoning certain aspects of human behavior. He believed that more than natural phenomenon, I think the human behavior could be demonstrated with full certainty, and that could be done through geometrical reasoning. So, therefore, this geometry as well as this natural science, I mean particularly this development of mechanics, I mean these two things had tremendous influence on Hobbes's political thought. Now, so far as Hobbes is concerned, he always believed that truth could be basically understood, or truth could be unraveled through a clear definitions and correct deductions of their consequences, and therefore, this entire enterprise of, that is, science of politics, should be geared towards understanding this truth by making use of the new developments in science. Now, what happened, that this philosophy of nature, this transition from philosophy of nature to basically science of politics, Hobbes believed that the three steps have to be followed. The first step is that perception of body should be done in a simplest form. Number two, that man as a natural body, man is a natural body of a particular kind. So, this has to be also recognized and valued. And the third is that commonwealth is a type of artificial body contrived by reason, because commonwealth, this is something what happens after this contract among the people in a state of nature. So, this philosophical reasonings basically in Hobbes's opinion deals with cause effect solution, and it seeks to basically anticipate the effect of known causes and ascertain the causes of known effect of basically those causes. So, therefore, this cause effect relationship, which is perhaps the heart of a scientific model, was also central to his entire enterprise. Now, he in fact to some extent believed that in nature, now in fact the only possible causes could be understood, but when it comes to politics, in fact it is not only possible causes, but the causes can be established with full certainty. So, to some extent he believed that the scientific method in politics could be more effective than perhaps the scientific method of does in nature, because in nature only you have the possible causes could be ascertained, but when it comes to politics it could be ascertained with full finality and full certainty, because the way he believed that this geometrical argument could also be made use of. Now, with this argument, what happens, that Hobbes starts his discussion of human nature. Now, what is human nature? Why basically men basically ultimately entered into this covenant or this contract to create this state of nature? What was the necessity? What was the requirement? And therefore, he basically bases his entire argument on human nature, and he says that as I was arguing earlier, that making use of this mechanical explanation of Galileo, because Galileo had a tremendous influence on him, he says that human nature is basically nasty, brutish and short. So, he basically picturizes or paints a very bad nature of human beings, and it is here one can make a comparison between what Hobbes says and what Aristotle had said. And we had discussed in our discussion on Aristotle that for Aristotle man is a political animal, and similarly another thinker, the medieval thinker Aquinas, had believed that man is a social animal, but unlike Aquinas and Aristotle, Hobbes argued that man is neither political nor social. By nature it is basically wicked, by nature it is basically bad, and therefore, in order to control that nature you need external force, and that external force, he basically argues, could be only a state which would basically put human beings in peace, in order and in basically a normal situation. So, therefore, he starts with this argument that is basically human nature. Now, this behavior, I mean basically he does this behavioral thing as well, saying that the human behavior, how human beings will act in a state of nature, because this discussion of human nature brings him to the discussion of a state of nature. Now, what is this state of nature? This is a hypothetical state of nature in Hobbes's argument. Now, this state of nature is basically creation of a hypothetical situation, that how would be people when there is no basically law, when there is no authority, when there is no order. And therefore, this hypothetical state of nature becomes the most important premise on basis of which Hobbes develops his political thinking. Now, a state of nature, he is saying that a state of nature is basically a state of warfare, that everyone is fighting against everyone. Of course, there is liberty, natural liberty, but that liberty is useless. Everyone feels that whatever he or she can lay hand on is his or her own. So, therefore, there is no concept of basically order, there is no concept of basically political authority, and so on and so forth. So, a state of nature becomes a state of warfare. Now, what happened that as by using this mechanical method, what he says that this, because man is also in motion, man is like any natural object, and every object has an innate quality of being in motion. So, what he says that this motion makes human being puts human being in incessant activity, always moving, and that movement, that activity is driven by a desire, innate desire, and desire or appetite, one can say, to gain power over others. So, this is the state of nature, that man is in a movement, because that is the nature, innate nature of all objects, and human beings are no different. And because they are in motion, they are incessant activity, and that activity is characterized by desire for or appetite for power over the others. So, that basically create that situation of warfare, that everyone wants to dominate over others, because basically it is something like law of fisheries, that the more powerful and the bigger fish will eat away the smaller one. So, therefore, this law of fisheries is the law of nature. Now, in order to satisfy one's own psychological needs or psychological feelings or material feelings, what happens is in a state of nature that everyone is trying to dominate over the other. So, therefore, society here simply becomes a means to that end. The end is the self gratification, and therefore, society is not end, rather it is a means in this scheme of things which basically Hobbes puts before us. So, now what in Hobbes' analysis, it is appetite is a driving force behind a struggle for power. So, there is a two important premises here, that there is appetite in every human beings, and that appetite is for power. So, basically power view, one later on traces in the power view of politics in Hobbes, that how Hobbes made the quest for power, the appetite for power as the central force in human beings in a state of nature, or when the society was not in existence, or before human beings came into this society. So, therefore, human beings in this characterization becomes an egoistic creature, that full of egos. Only basically they bother for themselves, they do not bother for others, because they do not know what is others' interest. They are only aware about their own interests. So, they become, in other words, the captives of the motions of mind, because it is the mind which is driving them, and the mind is basically not only driving, but also determining their appetite. So, what happened that this body, this satisfaction of this body is basically largely guided by the drive or basically the force of mind. So, mind is guiding this body of human being. So, what happens that this this entire argument of motion, which I was mentioning, that he draws from Galileo, that hop from simple to complex motion, this is basically the law of the evolution of nature according to Galileo's argument. Now, this influenced him, and therefore, what simple to complex argument, and how motion moves from simple to complex. Galileo's argues, this Hobbes argues that this political this appetite or this political motion is basically the product of psychological motion, and the psychological motion is a product of physiological motion, and physiological motion is the product of physiochemical motion. So, there are 4 layers of motions, one influencing the other. So, physical and physicochemical motion of human body influencing the physiological overall physiological construction or the composition or contents of human beings, and that physiological basically shaping and determining the psychological features of human beings, and that psychological ultimately resulting into this political. So, therefore, from simple to complex, the movement, I mean this graduation from simple to complex, as it is argued by Galileo in his theory of motion, basically Hobbes applies into politics, that how this physiological leads to psychological, because what is this physiological? That in a state of nature all human beings are equal, because they have equal power and they want to dominate over others. This is there basically largely on account of incessant activity, and that activity is basically the desire or appetite for power. So, they want to dominate on others, but their power in terms of quantity is the same. So, therefore, they fail to do so, and therefore, because they fail to do so, so therefore, they always live a life of they always live in a life of fear and insecurity. So, this fear insecurity argument, which basically Hobbes concludes from describing human nature and state of nature, is the product of this argument on motion, and that motion from simple to complex, and how this physical motion of human beings leads to this psychological motion, and that psychological motion has ultimately to graduate to this political. So, basically physical, as I said, that human beings have equal power in the state of nature. No one is superior, no one is inferior, everyone has an equal physical power. Now, that because of equal physical power, in spite of having this psychological appetite for more power, they are not being able to attain it, acquire it over others, and because of failure to attain and acquire it, what happens that they start living a life of they start living in a life of fear and insecurity. And in order to get out of this insecurity, what he says, that in a state of nature one has to move through contract towards the institution of a state, because only the institution of a state will get rid of, they can get rid of their insecurity and fear. So, basically this is to be seen in context of the period in which he was writing. In fact, he went to the extent of saying that I and fear were the twin brothers, because he was writing in the context of civil war, and therefore, it was a situation in his own psychology was reflected in this statement when he said I and fear were the twin brothers. So, therefore, this is a methodological argument so far as this human nature is concerned. Now, with this type of human nature, he hypothesizes about a state of nature. Of course, it is a hypothetical, because it is not a historical fact, but it said that it is basically an argument to arrive at a philosophical truth. Now, what happened, that this state of nature, as I was saying, that state of warfare, and this state of nature, human beings' life was brutish and short, and therefore, how to overcome it, and that can be overcome only through a contract. So, therefore, what I mentioned in the beginning, that first important thing which happens, that this entire divine origin theory of a state is demolished, and in place of divine origin theory, he lays the foundation for a new argument for social contract, that is human beings who have created the state in their own interest. So, therefore, it becomes a kind of utilitarian argument that human beings in their own interest have created this state. So, basically first of all, he makes the will of the people as the basis of this state, not any other thing. For example, he does not say that it is the creation of God, he does not say that it is creation of any external force, it is the creation of society itself. Now, what happened, as I was telling you, that this human beings in this state of nature, he says that are equal in their attributes, physical attributes, and therefore, he also lays the foundation for natural equality, that there is a natural equality of human beings. Of course, this equality he does basically takes forward, but one argument is significant, that people are equal in terms of their natural attributes, and largely because of their equality in natural attributes, that they also face this problem of basically dominating over others, which is their psychological requirement as per their appetite for power. Now, what happened, that in order to basically come out of this state of nature, what human beings do, because they are rational agents, they are guided by their reason, and that reason tells them that the only way they can get out of this state of nature is enter into a contract or covenant, and this contract basically gives rise to or birth to a state. That is authority which is basically external to them, in the sense that they create through covenant a political order or political authority. Now, that political authority becomes the state in Hobbesian discourse. Now, this state therefore has for the first time what happens, that it brings order back. So, in Leviathan number of analogies he gives. One analogy is basically the analogy of lantern, that the moment this this light in the lantern moves in different direction, and just by inserting a lens, what happen, a glass, what you do, that you bring some order to this this light. So, similarly what happens, that by just inserting this sovereign, this state in this society, some order is restored back. So, this is how the state comes into existence. But now, unlike other social contract theorists like Hobbes, like Locke and Rousseau, Hobbes basically doesn't move in direction of giving this state a democratic image or democratic color. Rather, he turns in direction of making it absolute source of power and sovereignty. And therefore, what happens, that with this human nature and this state of nature, Hobbes moves in a direction where he starts theorizing the state, that what is this state, and therefore he basically start discussing 3-4 important attributes of state, and the first important attribute is sovereignty. That is basically the power of the state, the absolute power of the state. Now, what is basically, who is the sovereign? Now, sovereign in this sense is basically the monarch, the absolute monarch, absolutism. And therefore, as I was mentioning, that Bodha was the first person who talked about sovereignty, but he put many restraints on sovereignty. For example, the 3 important restraints which Bodha put on it was the restraint of property, the restraint of constitutional law, and the restraint of basically even the religion. But Hobbes removed all these restraints, and therefore one can say that in a true sense of the term, Hobbes became not only pioneer but the father of this monastic theory of sovereignty, that sovereignty is basically without any restraints. So, even law, basically law in fact he defined as the command of the sovereign. He totally dismissed this concept of natural rights and natural law. He said that law means only when it is legal, and that is basically when it is the command of the sovereign. So, basically this positivist notion of law, because positivist notion of law would not recognize any natural theory of law, it is a legal theory of law. So, therefore, in Hobbes what happens, that law becomes a positive law and rights become the legal rights, not natural rights, that they are not men do not inherit them from nature, because men get them from the laws. And what is law? Law is the command of the sovereign. So, basically it is flowing from the sovereign. And who is the sovereign? In his opinion or in his ideas or in his writings, it is a monarch who is the sovereign, because he was justifying the monarchical form of government, the royalty, because that was the situation in his time, when basically monarchy he believed was the only option. And therefore, if we look at this history of Britain, then England, then you find that when monarchy was restored back, and James II was restored back to his throne after the initial turbulent period in which the parliament had dethroned him, and even rather his father was executed. So, this restoration of James II, and therefore the kind of understanding which developed between parliament and the monarchy, in fact also to some extent gives us some idea that in what context Hobbes was writing and theorizing. So, what happens? So, basically this law therefore in Hobbes' opinion is the command of the sovereign, and there is only one theory of rights which is ready to accept, and that is the legal theory of rights, not natural theory of rights, that by nature human beings do not inherit any rights. Whatever rights are there, those rights have to be recognized by law. Only law can give you rights. If there is no law, then there is no rights. For example, in a state of nature, human beings did not have any rights, because there was only law of nature, and law of nature cannot guarantee any rights. As I mentioned, that everyone had appetite for power and everyone wanted to attain power, and in order to attain power one was dominating over the others. But because there was a natural equality in terms of physical attributes of human beings, so it was not possible. And since it was not possible, so what happened, there was always a state of fear and anarchy. And if everyone was living in a situation of insecurity, and only it was that insecure mind which basically necessitated the occurrence of this covenant or contract through which this state was founded. Now what happens therefore, that now we find that with this argument of human nature, state of nature and establishment of the state, Hobbes also moves to in different directions, where he is as he basically thought that he was going to lay the foundation for science of politics. So Hobbes then moves to a number of interesting arguments, and one of the important argument is liberty. That what is liberty? And there are, as it is known, that there are two concepts of negative liberty and positive liberty. And in Hobbes's writing, what we get, that man has freedom only when law is silent. So that means whatever law gives you is your freedom. If law doesn't permit you, then you cannot claim that freedom at all. So this is what we can also see in Hobbes. Now apart from liberty, there is also a question of this political obligation. That what is this political obligation in Hobbes? And this is something very important, because political obligation question emerges with this posure, that why do we obey a state? Now this is perhaps the central question in the entire history of political thought, so far as the state is concerned, and political thought always basically wrestles with this issue of state. So why do we obey a state is a central question, and it is a question which is normally presented as a question of political obligation. So for Hobbes, why do we obey the state, or why do men obey a state, is clear and quite short. He says that men obey a state because they need a state, because their existence is dependent on the state. If there is no state, then there is no human society. So basically what happens, that in Hobbes there is only one contract. That contract creates both society, that is civil society, as well as the state. So once you dissolve that contract, then it is not only the state which basically it gets dissolved, but society also gets dissolved, and you are back to the state of nature. So therefore this threat is that unless you render political obligation, you will again revert back to that anarchy. So in order to escape that anarchy, one has to politically feel obliged to the state, one has to render full obligation to the state. Therefore Hobbes doesn't give any right for rebellion, right to rebellion, or any freedom for revolution, because he believes that revolt and rebellion would again lead to this state of chaos and anarchy which was there in a state of nature. So political obligation therefore in Hobbes is also quite clear, that people have an obligation towards the state, largely because people get their rights, they get their freedom, they get everything due to the state, because there is nothing called natural rights, there is nothing called natural law. All these things are superfluous. There is only one thing, that is the legal rights and legal law, and law is the command of the sovereign. So therefore you have to render your obligation towards the state and the ruler. Now of course, who is this ruler? The Leviathan, of course, the imagery is itself clear. It is basically absolute monarchy, monarchical form of government that he was talking of. So therefore this political obligation, law and natural rights, all these things arguments in Hobbes are basically presented in an orderly fashion to justify this absolute state. Now of course Hobbes's writings have also been criticized. For example, when Hobbes says that in a state of nature man is brutish in sort, or the way he characterizes human nature, I think many thinkers have not agreed to this characterization. For example, coming to the Karl Marx, he would say that human nature basically is not by nature bad, but this nature becomes the way Hobbes is characterizing is largely because of the social situation, economic situation. He is basically the product of a particular situation that society makes him the way he behaves. So, the problem is not human, the problem is social. So, therefore, in order to rectify the human nature, it is not a solution that you bring in some external force like a state, rather you solve the problem by addressing the question of society and economy. So, therefore, they would say that what Hobbes is doing is simply arguing about a man in a particular context, a particular society, that is a capitalist society, where basically they have only appetite, they have only a feeling of acquisitiveness to acquire more. This having more without having the full realization of human potential is a capitalist product of the capitalist society. And taking clue from that, one of the important commentator on Thomas Hobbes is C.V. Macpherson in his book Possessive Individualism. He basically called Hobbes's argument or Hobbes's description of human nature as possessive individualism, that individuals only want to possess more. And he said that this was basically the characterization of man in capitalist society. It is not the characterization of man for all society. This is a typical bourgeois notion of man. And number two, lot of people have argued that even this entire argument for creating a more orderly situation, or creating a kind of peace and stability and tranquility, or having a powerful monarch or a powerful state with attributes of this type of sovereignty which Hobbes basically argues for, I think was also the requirement of capitalism at that period of time, because it was a phase of nascent capitalism. Capitalism was growing, and therefore there was a turmoil, as we have mentioned, that religious wars were a continuous phenomenon at that period of time. There was a fight between the church and the state. Later on there was a fight between the state and the parliament, and all these fights had resulted into kind of disquiet and basically turbulence. And therefore, capitalism, the entrepreneurship, and those who were indulging in business activities, industrial activities, they were suffering, and therefore there was a requirement that a powerful political authority could come and could restore order in society. So, Hobbes's writings therefore are also seen as a product of that period, when capitalism needed that type of argument or justification for an absolute state, and kind of monistic theory of sovereignty which Hobbes propounds. So, similarly, for example, Christopher Hill, one of the historians, he said that Hobbesian man is a bourgeois man whom policeman removes. So, therefore, the kind of character he is basically depicting of human beings, the kind of nature he is speaking of is basically a bourgeois construct. It is not basically, it is not in fact the situation, or it is not the characterization of human beings in normal situation. So, therefore, in fact, Marx much earlier had talked of these problems of capitalism, because Marx and others were writing when capitalism had stabilized. It had already developed and its true colors could be seen, but Hobbes was writing at a different period of time. It was basically the period of the development of capitalism. It was still in its infancy, it was nascent capitalism, and therefore, what happens that Hobbes is arguing the way he argues about absolute reality, absolute monarchism, monarchical form of government, etc. and etc. But nonetheless, in spite of these contexts in which his writings basically emerged, and today we know that what was the context and why he was writing, but nonetheless the value and this the force of his writings and argument cannot be dismissed altogether, because number A, he made the will of the people basically the basis of the state. He basically created the basis for monistic theory of sovereignty, which later on was carried forward by number of thinkers, Austin and so on and so forth. Now, similarly on issue of rights, he basically laid the foundation for legal theory of rights, which Bentham and others, because Bentham went to the extent of saying that natural rights are nonsense upon a stilt, and many others who developed this argument of legal theory of rights. Political obligation, which is perhaps one of the important issues in political thought. In fact, Hobbes made pioneer contribution. Even in terms of the civil society argument, the way he says that how civil society functions, I think some of the arguments which are available in Hobbes are quite significant. And most importantly, he laid the foundation for secular basis for sovereignty, and that is important, because this was the time when secularism as a creed or as a doctrine was also emerging. That secularization of society was going on incessantly, and therefore, this entire initiative or entire attempt to base political authority on secular principles, keeping religion out of picture, because he believed that science, the way science doesn't deal with supernatural or religious, it deals with matter, and the science of politics should also confine itself with the material and not the supernatural. And therefore, this mechanical materialism which I was referring is central to his entire understanding. So, therefore, looking at the whole gamut of arguments or the whole corpus of ideas which come through his writings, particularly this Leviathan, are very important today when we try to understand the evolution of liberal political thought in the West, and particularly the way it was taken forward by other contract theorists like Locke and Rousseau later, and moved in direction of argument for democracy, which is perhaps the dominant creed today. So, with these words, I think that I would like to stop today's lecture on Hobbes's political thought.
Thank you so much, sir. This is very interesting and insightful lecture. Sir, I would like to ask a few questions to you. So, you have mentioned that two terms like liberalism and capitalism. Can you throw more light on these terms?
Yeah, in fact, capitalism was kind of economic order which emerged in modern times based on free enterprises or the production process,
yes,
in which a lot of developments took place, particularly after the society transited from feudalism to capitalism, where you had machine based production,
yes,
wage labor, the capital, and most importantly the market,
yes,
right? And it was of course the economic organization, economic structure, but that was also characterized number of things, the free contract among the people,
yes,
unlike the earlier era when you had the bounded laborers and lack of freedom of contract, I mean in feudal period.
Yes,
so, capitalism was of course a system of production process which emerged in modern times.
yes.
So, another thing that liberalism was the political philosophy or ideology of this type of society or this type of organization, and liberalism basically included many things, including the free will of the people, autonomy of individual, right, certain ethical principles like equality, liberty and justice. So, in fact, liberalism was the political philosophy of this type of social economic organization called capitalism.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. Sir, this is very interesting lecture and your answers also. Dear friends, if you have any other question regarding this lecture, please write us back on our official email ID, which will be showing just after this lecture. Thank you.